Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Today's class is going to be about the discovery and the robbing of Egypt after Belzoni and Champollion. But we have to really start off with casting our mind back to the great Belzoni. If you remember from the class I did on the great Belzoni, he took so much material back from Egypt, he was able to open his own museum. And this started off a phase of what we can call Egyptomania in England. Everybody in England wanted something from ancient Egypt. Everybody, or some people, wanted houses built like ancient Egyptian temples. Well, this same pattern of Egyptomania started off in France, with the publication, first of all, of the description of Egypt volumes, and then, of course, Champollion deciphering hieroglyphics. So the French, of course, wanted to get involved more involved in Egypt. Egyptomania was started to spread throughout Europe. The Egyptian government at the time began to realize the economic potential of this Egyptomania. The Egyptians had been conquered by the Islamic Arabs in about 642. Most of the population of Egypt after 642 converted to Islam. The Egyptian government in the early 19th century really didn't have any interest in the pre-Islamic past of Egypt, nor did the ordinary people. And the Egyptian government could see that this was a way of making money. They could sell the antiquities to European collectors. The Egyptian people didn't really care about these things either. They were embarrassing reminders of a time when the country had not turned to Islam as a religion. So what we start seeing in the early 19th century, after Belzoni, after Champollion, is a period in which the Egyptian government would issue antiquities licenses, establish an official antiquities trade, and basically sell antiquities to European museums. The thing you have to also remember here is, of course, that the early 19th century was the time when the European nations were in great competition with each other to establish international museums. As I've said before, it was a time when a country thought that having an international museum, a world-famous museum, signified the status of that country. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York began in exactly the same kind of way, buying up material to fill up a wonderful museum. So what we see happening in the early 19th century in Egypt is antiquities collectors being sent by governments to Egypt to find what they could, to buy what they could, and then send it back to their hometown or home country. For example, Karl Richard Lepsius. He was employed by the Emperor of Prussia. There was no unified Germany at this time. He was employed by the Emperor of Prussia to go to Egypt between 1843 and 1845. He traveled all around Egypt, he got a license to export antiquities, and he sent back to Berlin in 1845 15,000 separate antiquities from Egypt. Well, to his credit, he did do a lot of work on ancient Egypt as well. And he published in 1849 a book called the Denkmäler aus Ägypten und Äthiopien. This was the Prussian equivalent of the French description of Egypt, which began to be published under the Emperor Napoleon. But it was much more advanced in many ways than the French description, because, of course, Lepsius could use Champollion's hieroglyphics, he could date the objects he was reporting, and he actually eventually ended up by giving a chronology, a list of Egyptian rulers with approximate dates, which we still use to a certain extent today. Well, this lack of interest in the pre-Islamic past of Egypt also extended to any relics and antiquities that belonged to the Christian minority. The Egyptians had essentially converted to Christianity in the 4th century after Christ, and there was still a substantial number of Christian communities in Egypt in the 19th century. It's gradually reduced in numbers, but even today, 10% roughly of the population of Egypt is Christian. Well, the French weren't really in a position to get large antiquities out of Egypt. The British more or less stopped them from doing that. But the Louvre Museum in Paris did have a wonderful collection of Coptic language manuscripts from the Coptic Church. They also had early Christian writings in Syriac and Ethiopian. So they decided to improve their collections of early Christian books from Egypt. And for this reason, they decided to send one of the assistants out to Egypt to see what he could find and then send back to the Louvre, so that the Louvre Museum could boast its collection. It had the best collection of Christian books, early Christian books, anywhere in Europe. The assistant they chose to send out there was Auguste Mariette, and here we have a photograph of him shortly after he arrived in Egypt in 1850. Auguste Mariette basically grew up as a fairly simple family background, not lots of money. He was a journalist by profession, a part-time teacher, but one of his relatives had travelled with Champollion to Egypt in 1828 and 1829. And when that relative died, Mariette started to go through the relative's papers. He became fascinated by ancient Egypt. He learnt how to read and write hieroglyphics. He also learnt Coptic. And it was his knowledge of hieroglyphics that won him his first professional job. His local museum said, "Why don't you come and sort out our Egyptology collections?" And he did this in 1846. He published a catalogue of the local museum's collections in Boulogne in France. And this was so popular, it became known to the Louvre Museum, who gave him a job as a museum assistant in 1848. It was here that his knowledge of Coptic really came into great use. He was more interested in ancient Egypt than Christian Egypt, but the museum said, "Well, we would like you to go to Egypt to go and buy Coptic manuscript, Coptic Bibles, anything from the early Christian period of Egypt." He arrived in Alexandria and didn't prove very successful. He couldn't find anything that was for sale. And of course, his real interest was in ancient Egypt. So he started to look around for any antiquities he could find that he might be able to buy and send back to the Louvre. And it was in this way that he made his way, one way, to a garden, the home of a local antiquities collector, and he saw a number of stone sphinxes sitting in the garden. Well, this is what he's really interested in, so he said, "Well, where do these sphinxes come from?" And the owner told him that they came from a place called Saqqara. Saqqara is about 40 kilometers south of modern Cairo. What Mariette realized at this point was that he knew that an avenue of sphinxes had existed at Saqqara. Like most antiquarians of the day, early archaeologists, he'd done his classical reading. He'd read the writings of the Greek writer Strabo. Strabo had traveled around Egypt at the end of the 1st century BC, and Strabo described that how at Saqqara there was a long line of sphinxes on either side of a major road leading from the ancient Egyptian capital of Memphis to the burial place of Saqqara. More to the point, they led directly to a place that was known as the Serapeum. The Serapeum. Well, by this time, of course, people could read hieroglyphics. So, in addition to the information given by Strabo, Mariette knew a lot more about the Serapeum than Strabo could have known. What was then known, early 19th century, about the Serapeum was that this was the place where the sacred bull of the god Apis was buried. The religion of Apis was also quite well known from hieroglyphic writings. Apis was the traditional protector god of the city of Memphis. He was worshipped on earth as a living bull. The living Apis bull was the god's representative on earth. This is how people saw it. The living Apis bull was also the most sacred animal in the whole of Egypt, And while it was alive, it basically lived like a pharaoh. It was shown to the public on the ceremonies connected with the worship of the god Apis. The bull would be taken through the streets. People would make offerings to the bull. If the bull looked over at the offering, then that person would have good luck for the future. And people would put up altars to thank the Apis bull for pointing out that they would have good luck for the year to come. If the Apis bull did not look at you when you offered it something, then you basically had bad luck. Well, given the importance of the Apis bull in everyday life in ancient Egypt, it was natural that when it died, it lived like a pharaoh when it was alive. When it died, it was treated like a pharaoh. The people of Egypt would mourn and not eat during daylight for a total of 70 days. And during that period of 70 days, the body of the Apis bull would be mummified, just like a real pharaoh or somebody else. Then it was given a large burial ceremony at the Serapeum. Taken down this street lined with sphinxes to be buried in the Serapeum itself. Then the priest of Egypt would start looking for a new Apis bull. And we're fortunate that the writer Herodotus, who went to Egypt at a much earlier date, gives us a description of how the Apis bull was selected. It had to be a newly born bull, and it had to have a specific set of marks on its body. It had to have a diamond mark on its forehead, the mark of an eagle on its back, a mark like a scarab beetle under its tongue, and in addition to this, it had to have twice the usual number of hairs in its tail. When an Apis bull was found, a new Apis bull was found, it was taken to Memphis on a barge and treated again as the living representative of the god on earth. Well, the worship of the Apis bull continued to be a major factor in Egyptian life right down to the time that Egypt was captured by Alexander the Great in 331 BC and afterwards, right down to the Christian period. What we find happening under Ptolemy I, the ruler of Egypt after Alexander died, is the creation of a new unifying religion under a new god called Serapis. But Ptolemy I identifies Serapis with the Apis bull. What this means is that the Apis bull ceremony now becomes connected to worship of this new god Serapis, and this is why the burial place of the Apis bull became known as the Serapeum. Well, Mariette knows everything that could be known about the worship of the Apis bull and the Serapeum, and of course about the writings of Strabo. Strabo specifically says that the avenue, the road of sphinxes, went from Memphis to the Serapeum, so he decided, I'm going to go and look for this. Well, he had to do this in absolute secrecy. To begin with, his license, issued by the Egyptian government, was to collect early Christian books. The money given to him by the Louvre was to collect early Christian books. There was also a slight problem in that the local village rulers were very jealous of their antiquities. They knew that they could find these things and sell them to European collectors, so they didn't want anybody else moving in on their territory. But even so, Mariette made his way to Saqqara, where he saw its most visible monument, the Step Pyramid of Zoser. This is Egypt's oldest monumental building, built for the pharaoh Zoser about 2691-2625 BC. He knew that the Serapeum had to be somewhere in the vicinity of the Step Pyramid of Zoser. And sure enough, he started working, absolute secrecy, as much as you can keep anything secret in Egypt, found the head of a sphinx, then found another one, and eventually found a line of 100 sphinxes. This is his drawing at the time. It's an exaggerated drawing, like so many of these drawings are at this period. It wasn't that deep beneath the sand. It was only about sort of 3 or 4 meters below the sand, so it's much more exaggerated. So he found this line of sphinxes, and he found at either end the remains of temples. When you go to the site today, the sphinxes unfortunately have all been moved into the museum, but you can see they're very beautifully made. The original total is not quite certain. It may have been about 500 or so. But Mariette, having found the first sphinx, gradually digs up the whole road. He finds at one end the remains of a temple structure, which he recognizes from the inscription on it belongs to the Greek period and is the Serapeum proper. At the other end, though, was a large temple enclosure, which he believed must represent the original burial place of the Apis bull in the pre-Egyptian, pre-Greek periods. Well, Mariette now decided that perhaps I ought to tell the Louvre what I'm doing, get an official permit, get some more money to work on the site. The Louvre agreed that he should continue working there. What Mariette said was, I have found something which is otherwise only known of from the writings of a long-dead Greek writer. This will be a major discovery. France will become the most famous of the European countries because we have found something that nobody really knew existed before. So in 1851, the Louvre applied for a license for him to work at Saqqara. More money was sent to him, and he went back, or he continued to work at the site. He realized he had one big problem, and that was that 4 years would not be long enough to pay for the excavation, or rather 4 years would not be long enough to excavate everything in this area in the usual way, using shovels and things like that. So what he decided to do was to use explosives, gunpowder, to blow up any rocks that were in the way, to blow holes in the ground, and this way he would make the work much quicker. Within a few weeks of starting, using gunpowder, he manages to blow up an ancient tomb, a complete ancient tomb. It had a mummy inside it. It also had on the mummy case this particular sign here. We call it a pectoral because it's essentially a chest ornament. But a pectoral like this was something that was only worn by members of the Egyptian royal family. Well, of course, hieroglyphs could be read, and he was able to discover that the tomb he had blown up, which had been complete until he set the explosives off, was the tomb of a man called Kemwesa, who was the fourth son and the favorite son of the ruler Ramses II, Pharaoh 1279-1213, and also high priest of Apis. But although he realized the danger in using explosives to blow up any rock or soil that was in the way, this didn't stop him from continuing to use the same method to try and find the entrance to the burial place of the Apis bulls. So he keeps on using explosives, and then eventually one day he finds the entrance, a series of steps leading down into a long series of underground chambers. This was what he was looking for. He knew that the burial place had to be underground. This had to be the original Serapeum. He made his way down into the chambers there, filled with rubbish and dust and bats and all sorts of things like that. Underground chambers cut all the way through the rock. Here's his plan of the Serapeum, and you can see the big long corridor with the separate burial places on either side for the different Apis bulls. Well, he found 24 sarcophagi in the first part of the chamber. All of them had been emptied, so there was nothing surviving of the Apis bull, a few scraps of gold which had decorated the mummified body. Each of the sarcophagi was carved from a single piece of granite. They weighed roughly between 60 and 80 tons, so you can imagine the effort of making these and then transporting them to the burial place to receive the body of the Apis bull. He then started to look at the inscriptions and discovered that these gave complete lists of the rulers of Egypt at the time each Apis bull had been buried. He also found statues like this one here, which is now in the Louvre, representations of the Apis bull, which must have been worshipped in the various villages. And finally, at the very end of the chamber, the underground passages, he did find 2 preserved burials. Well, this is his drawing of one of the bull mummies, the Apis bull mummies, as it was actually found. It's now displayed in a case, so you can't really get a very good photograph of it. But this is a very large animal, completely mummified in the same way that the pharaohs were mummified, and provided with grave goods, the same way that the pharaohs were given grave goods to take to the afterlife with them. One of the processes involved in mummification is you don't want the body to rot, so you take out all the internal organs and the brain, pick it out of the nose using a long piece of wire. That's how they did it then. Later times they did it in a different way. These organs, however, the internal organs, were considered necessary for the animal or the person to become alive again in the afterlife. And so they were always buried with the animal or the person in what we call canopic jars. These are the 4 canopic jars that were found with one of the Apis bull mummies there, originally containing the heart, the lungs, the brain, the intestines, and so forth. The Apis bull mummies, however, were also provided with these. We call them Ushabti figures. They're miniature representations of servants and priests, and these were meant to come alive in the afterlife so that they could continue to serve the Apis bull in that afterlife. Well, these were pretty magnificent finds in many ways, but what was to prove to be the real treasure that Mariette found at the Serapeum were the hundreds of inscriptions there, some on sarcophagi, some on tablets. Each sarcophagus, for example, had a year list for when the bull had been born and when it had died, complete with the name of the pharaoh. What this meant was Mariette was able to put all these year lists together to give a chronology, a series of dates for the different pharaohs. Other tablets gave records of the priest of Apis, again dated by pharaohs. So he was able to correlate, to cross-match all these things, and for the first time really actually give a detailed, in a sense, year-by-year list of ancient history, a dated history for ancient Egypt. There hadn't been one before this. There was the list prepared by Manetho of the Egyptian pharaohs with approximate dates. How could you trust that? Nobody really quite knew. But what he had at the Serapeum were the names of other pharaohs. He could compare the dates on those with Manetho's list and tighten up the chronology for more than 1,000 years of ancient history at the Serapeum in Egypt. The strange thing is that by the time he finished work at the Serapeum and reported his discoveries to the Louvre, Mariette had undergone a distinctive change in his personality and psychology. He had fallen in love with Egypt. He'd always been fascinated with Egypt. He'd fallen in love with the remains of ancient Egypt, and he had begun to see, one of the first archaeologists to see this, he had begun to see the value of Egypt's antiquities to the living population of Egypt as their heritage, as relics of their past, even if they were not necessarily interested in them because they were pre-Islamic. He began to believe that Egypt should keep its antiquities, that it was wrong for European collectors, like the Louvre, to come to Egypt to rob Egypt of all its antiquities. The key element in trying to understand, if you like, this change of heart from being a European collector to somebody who's protecting the heritage of Egypt was his realization that only Egypt could properly look after these remains if they knew their value and keep them in one place for future scholars to see them. They would mean so much more in their original home, in collections, rather than with some in the British Museum, some in Sir John Soane's museums, some in the Louvre Museum, some in the Imperial Museum in Berlin. Unfortunately, though, the arrangement that the Louvre Museum had made with the Egyptian government for Mariette to work at the site gave the Louvre Museum 50% of everything that he actually found while working at Saqqara. And so it was that, although Mariette didn't really approve of this, 230 separate boxes of antiquities made their way from Egypt to the Louvre, Mariette going with them. The treasure including much of the material from the tomb of Kamwesi, many of the treasures from the Serapeum, the tablets of ancient priests, and he went back to Paris to be appointed as assistant curator of the Louvre's Egyptology department. But so strong was his feeling about the need for these things to stay in Egypt that word soonly spread around about this, and eventually came to the ears of Said Pasha, the then Khedive or ruler of Egypt. Said Pasha, like most of the rulers of Egypt, had spent his youth in Constantinople. He grew up in Constantinople at the court of the Ottoman Sultan, then made his way back to Egypt, where he became more and more exposed out of interest in European attitudes towards the past, European ideas about how to improve the country. And in 1858, he offered Mariette the position of Conservator of Antiquities for Egypt, complete with an official costume. So here you see Mariette in his official costume, Conservator of Egypt's Antiquities. Mariette immediately took the chance to go back to Egypt, resigned his position at the Louvre Museum, went to Egypt with his family, arrived there, set up home in Cairo, and within a month or so arranged with the Khedive to issue a law that nobody should be able to work in Egypt on any of Egypt's ancient sites except with the approval of Mariette. Well, what this meant, of course, was that Mariette, for the next 25 years or so, basically controlled Egyptology and Egyptian archaeology. It gave him the chance to work at any site he wanted to, but he still had to deal with a number of local problems. The Khedive, technically the ruler of Egypt, couldn't control every single one of the local village rulers and so forth. And we get one of these episodes in his life that matches what we see in films like Indiana Jones and so forth. His workmen found at Thebes the undisturbed burial of Queen Ahotep. She was a very late Egyptian queen, 560–530 BC. Word was sent back to Cairo, where Mariette was. You must come and see this and open it and see what we've got. But before Mariette could get to Thebes, he found out that the local ruler, the local village headman, had gone to the tomb and taken the mummy case out of the tomb and hid it in the harem of his palace, knowing that Mariette couldn't possibly go in there and come out alive. There he opened the mummy case and found the most amazing collection of late Egyptian jewelry. These are just two items. Here we have one bracelet with lapis lazuli and amethyst, not amethyst, cornelian stones, gold and silver inlaid. Here's another bracelet, again, basically gold with lapis lazuli as well. Well, when the local ruler saw what this inside this mummy case, he decided to use this for political advantage. He decided that he would send this as a present to the Khedive of Egypt. He would get the benefit. And so it was put on a sailing boat to go down the Nile. Mariette heard about this, put his hands in his pockets, paid for the hire of a steamboat, chased the sailing boat down the Nile, got hold of the sailing boat, got the material, and then took it to the Khedive himself. When he arrived in Cairo, he explained exactly what had happened to Said Pasha, who found the story so amusing, and found it so amusing that Mariette was so devoted to saving Egypt's antiquities. So he said, what I want you to do is to establish a museum. So the first National Museum of Egypt, the Boulak Museum at the end of this street here, with Mariette appointed its curator. But, said the Khedive, this jewellery is rather nice, isn't it? I'll just keep a couple pieces to myself. So that's the way things went at that time. Well, this was the first National Museum of Egypt, opened in 1863. This was the first real attempt to stop the flood of antiquities going out of Egypt, to give a home to everything that was found. Well, Mariette's discovery of the tomb of Kamwesa, the Serapeum, the tomb of Queen Ahotep are perhaps his most famous discoveries. These are the things we tend to read about in any life story of Mariette. But remember, he is still conservator of Egypt's antiquities. He and only he has the right to go and work anywhere, to excavate wherever he wants to do so. And for the rest of his career, he excavated something like 20 or so sites all over Egypt, each one resulting in very important discoveries. For example, he worked around the pyramids at Giza, he discovered a temple at the site of the Sphinx, but more importantly in many ways, he became the first person to systematically study what we know as mastaba tombs. Mastaba, you should be able to recognize what the word means. Masa, mastaba, table tomb. Because these are tombs dug in the ground with a flat top, so they look rather like a table. There are many mastaba tombs at Saqqara. It's the oldest cemetery in the whole of Egypt. Many of these have been looted, they've been robbed in the past. Mariette now decided to discover what these tombs are all about. And so he starts a series of excavations of the mastaba tombs, and here he is, Mariette, looking at one of these typical tombs, and makes a very careful excavation, a very careful record of everything he finds. Basically, the mastaba tomb originally would have had a temple on top, now long gone. But then there would be an entrance passageway leading down into the mastaba tomb itself, with a courtyard area inside for sacrifices, the tomb of the person who was buried there right at the very end. But the most significant thing was, these are some of the earliest tombs of noblemen in Egypt. And each one was carved and decorated with these really superb paintings. Paintings and relief carvings of everyday life in Egypt. So you see, for example, up here, you've got groups of people building boats. Here you've got somebody who's on a small boat. He's going through an area of high reeds, close to the River Nile. He's going fishing. There are his servants out there fishing out like that. You have wonderful reliefs of everyday life in the sense of servants carrying things to formal meals. This, of course, is the type of illustration that if you look at any book on ancient Egypt, early ancient Egypt, you see this type of illustration from the mastaba tombs. Mariette was the first person to properly excavate and record these, to make drawings of them, to publish them, and make them accessible for other scholars. But the mastaba tombs are also some of the earliest tombs that we have in Egypt, and they helped him understand a lot about Egyptian religious beliefs. So, for example, you would have imitation wooden doorways like this, usually with the statue of the dead person in front. This is the doorway that goes to the afterlife. Even more remarkable in many ways are the hieroglyphs which are found in the mastaba tombs. They're amongst the earliest of the hieroglyphs that we have, and they are the most perfectly formed. And if you go to somewhere like the British Museum and buy a book on how to read and do hieroglyphs, basically the hieroglyphs that they use are all taken from mastaba tombs. Well, Mariette also turned his attention to the standing remains of ancient Egypt, and especially of its temples. At this time, most of the ancient temples in Egypt were filled basically to their roofs with either sand or dirt. In some cases, villages had been built inside them. Others were being used as warehouses, storage areas, or stables. Some were even being used by the army as their headquarters. Mariette said to the Khedive, we have to clear these, we have to understand these. We can only do that by excavating them. And so, with the Khedive's backing, forced labour, the local villagers were told to go and dig these remains up for no pay. Thousands of tombs, thousands of temples. The best known of these is perhaps the one at Dendera. This is the temple at Dendera as it was seen in 1835, painted by the Scottish artist, can't remember his name now, David Roberts. And you can see how the sand is going all the way up there. You've even got the remains of buildings still inside it. When Mariette had finished with it, this is how you see it today in all its glory, beautifully exposed and beautifully preserved. Well, it was a rather hasty and random process. Mariette wasn't present at all these excavations. Modern archaeologists regret the fact, of course, that he removed, or rather the workers removed, everything that was later than the time of the pharaohs. So we have no knowledge of how buildings like this, which actually dates to the Greek period in Egypt, we have no knowledge of how buildings like this were used after the Christian period. He also, of course, helped create, in a sense, what you can call the beginnings of a tourist industry. As he cleared more and more of these temples and more tombs, word spread throughout Europe. People started to come to Egypt to look at its antiquities. As more and more Europeans made their way to Egypt to see the collections in the Bulaq Museum and the sites like the temple at Dendera, so Mariette had to respond to their demands. The Khedive said, the best way we can deal with what the public want is, why don't we give them a show about ancient Egypt? Mariette, I want you to prepare a show about ancient Egypt. Mariette did this in 1871 in his spare time. It was turned into an opera by Verdi. It became the opera you might know as Aida, with Mariette responsible for designing the costumes to be worn by the actors and singers, and also the stage background as well. So Mariette, not just an archaeologist. But it's important to point out, though, that Mariette didn't just simply uncover and restore temples like Dendera. He did publish very good plans of them. He made elaborate copies of the inscriptions on them, and these are still of enormous value to archaeologists today. But he went even further. He decided to try and interpret these things. So, for example, he would take a monument like the temple at Dendera. The basic plan of the temple at Dendera, a standard Egyptian temple, a plan that goes back 1,500 years, before his own 2,500 years before our time, even longer. Plans that inspired the Greeks when they started making their buildings out of stone. But the temple at Dendera dated to the Greek period. The latest building in the temple at Dendera actually dates to 30 BC. He decided to interpret these monuments, and he was the first person to come to the realization that unlike a church or a mosque, these temples were very similar and probably inspired the type of temple used in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, in the sense that the temple was the home of a god. A temple wasn't a place where people would go to and pray to the god or take part in a large ceremony. The temple was basically a home to the god. It wasn't a center for making confessions or prayer, but the temple would be the starting point of a procession by which the god would be taken out of the temple and shown to the people, and then taken back at the end. In many ways, he actually came up with the idea that the temples were kind of like a memory machine, with each part of the temple given over to a specific purpose. But because the temples kept the same plan from 2,500 years before the one at Dendera, basically This was such a long-term memory plan. Well, Mariette died in 1881 at the age of 59. He was buried, like one of his apis bull, in a giant sarcophagus, copied from one of the ones in the Serapeum, outside his museum in Bulak Museum. Then, 20 years later, his burial place, his sarcophagus, was moved to the building he always hoped would exist one day in Cairo, the National Museum of Antiquities, Mariette's burial place being just down there. Well, Mariette, we have to remember that his techniques of excavation at Saqqara and other places are not techniques we would really approve of today. We don't use explosives to blow up the ground to clear it. We don't blow up any rock that's in the way. We don't dig out everything just to get down to the thing we're really looking forward to. Mariette was also guilty of leaving his workmen to work on sites for weeks without actually going to see what they found. He would only record what was found when they'd finished their excavation. Even so, Mariette is the founder, really, of Egyptian archaeology, following in the path of Belzoni, following in the path of other people like Drovetti. But he's really the founder of modern Egyptology, modern Egypt archaeology. We're lucky that Mariette arrived in Egypt when he did. Remember, people like Lepsius were traveling around Egypt, collecting 15,000 antiquities to send back to their museum. The railways were beginning to arrive in Egypt. Boat passage up and down the Nile was getting much better. Tourists were already arriving in Egypt in search of antiquities. What he did was he changed from being a treasure seeker, an antiquities hunter, to an archaeologist, and he did it just at the right time. Thanks to Mariette, the antiquities trade, the official antiquities trade, came to an end. Well, not quite, because even today, a friend of mine who works for the British Museum, when he works in Egypt, the agreement is that the Egyptian government will keep one half of the material, the British Museum gets the other half. The big difference is the Egyptian government chooses what it wants to keep, instead of being left with what the European archaeologists decide they don't want. In addition, of course, Mariette's restorations of the temples and the mastaba tombs started off a tourist industry. A tourist industry which quickly became a major part of the Egyptian economy and still is a major part of the Egyptian economy today. We don't know if Mariette would have approved of that, though. He wrote shortly before his death that, quote, "More damage has been done to the Saqqara tombs within the last 10 years than in the previous 4,400 years of their existence." And this is the problem that Egyptologists still face today, and archaeologists everywhere. Yes, archaeologists love you to go and see the things that they find. Yes, you want to see the remnants of your heritage in your own country. But the more tourists that go to an archaeological site, the more damage the archaeological site suffers. Think, for example, of Ephesus, which some of you have probably been to. Ephesus today gets more visitors in one day than the total of its entire population when it was a living city 2,000 years ago. Imagine that time after time. Okay, we'll stop there and have a little break.